The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. Outside Ardmore Regional Hospital, freezing rain whipped against the glass windows. The waiting room was empty. Talia Mercer sat at her usual post at the triage desk. Her back was pressed firmly against the solid wall, and her black coffee had long since turned cold. Talia had chosen this exact chair for 2 years and 4 months. From here, she could monitor every single point of entry without turning her head. The ambulance bay, the waiting area doors, the trauma corridor, and the nearest fire exit. When checking an incoming patient, Talia always looked at their skin color, pupils, and respiratory cadence before glancing at the digital monitor. Metal trays could crash to the floor, and she would not flinch. She simply identified the sound source and kept working. Leona Briggs, the head trauma nurse, chattered to keep the sleepiness away. Talia answered in quiet, measured sentences. The stillness reminded Talia of the moments right before an MH-47 Chinook helicopter crossed into contested airspace. She squeezed her right thumb into her palm to anchor herself to the present. Upstairs, Dr. Graham Wexler was wrapping up a surgery. Brilliant, precise, and ruthless about hospital protocol. Wexler demanded that every decision be stated aloud and logged immediately. Staff called him arrogant. They did not know that inside his desk drawer sat an unsent letter of apology to the family of a patient who had died 6 years ago. That patient died because a former colleague had trusted an unverified hunch. Since that night, Wexler ruled the emergency department through absolute control. He viewed Talia as a reliable nurse, but one who was far too quiet and occasionally drifted too close to crossing boundaries. Suddenly, a black sedan slammed into reverse inside the ambulance bay. 2 masked men hauled a heavy body onto the cold concrete and sped off into the dark. No one caught the license plate. Talia and Leona rushed outside. The patient was a man in his late 40s with no wallet, no phone, and unusually clean clothes despite the trauma. Fresh needle marks dotted his left forearm, and a gaping laceration sat right above his clavicle. Talia pressed her gloved fingers against his neck and realized blood was pooling deep inside his chest cavity. He had minutes to live. The resident on duty, Dr. Peter Halloran, froze. He kept calling for a vascular surgeon while pressing blindly against the wound. Vitals plummeted. 3 minutes of waiting meant brain death. In Talia's mind, a memory flashed. A dark helicopter cabin, the deafening roar of rotor blades, and a wounded soldier drowning in his own blood. Talia did not ask for permission. She grabbed an off-label internal distractor clamp, inserted it directly into the tract, and manually locked the severed artery. The arterial hemorrhage stopped. The crashing blood pressure reading stabilized. Wexler burst into the trauma bay seconds later. He stared at the non-standard setup on the patient's neck. "Who authorized this?" he shouted. "You broke 5 major hospital regulations." Talia held her ground. "I understand the rules, doctor. But I also understand he still has a pulse." Wexler checked the monitor. Her quick fix had held. Before pushing the gurney into surgery, he leaned in, his eyes burning. "Where the hell did you learn that?" Talia looked at the blood drying on her hands. "Night stalkers don't quit." On the gurney, the unconscious man opened his eyes just a fraction. He looked straight at Talia and rasped a single whisper, "Raven Medic." The emergency surgery was a success, but the political storm hit immediately. Dr. Wexler walked straight into his office and drafted a formal violation report against Talia. He did not do it out of malice. He believed that if he overlooked her actions, another nurse without her elite training would try something similar tomorrow and kill a patient. Hospital administration suspended Talia pending an internal inquiry. She stripped off her gloves, washed the blood off her arms, and offered no defense. Leona followed her into the supply room. "You didn't guess back there, Talia?" Leona said softly. "You knew that insane maneuver would work." Talia kept her face neutral. "I've done it dozens of times in the back of moving aircraft. My nursing license wasn't the highest priority in that room." Leona stared at her. For 2 years, she had worked beside Talia, assuming she was just a private, introverted woman. Now she realized Talia's silence was an armor forged in places normal civilians could never comprehend. Before Talia could clear out her locker, 3 men in dark suits stepped off the main elevator. The lead man showed a federal badge from Defense Intelligence and ordered an immediate lockdown of the intensive care unit. He scanned the hallway and called out, "Sergeant Mercer." Wexler, who was standing nearby, stiffened. It was the first time he had ever heard a military rank attached to Talia's name. Major Adam Pike stepped forward and revealed the identity of the mysterious patient. Elias Voss. According to official military records, Voss had been declared dead 5 years ago. The mention of that name hit Talia like a physical blow. 5 years earlier, during Operation Black Lantern, Sergeant Talia Mercer had served as a flight medic with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. Elias Voss was the local informant who had provided the flight corridor for her unit. That corridor was a trap. Ambushed in the mountains, 3 of Talia's crewmates were killed in action. Voss vanished that same night. Talia had spent 5 years staring at Voss's photograph, convinced he had sold out her brothers for cash. Major Pike explained the reality of the current situation. A military weapons depot had been breached hours ago, and a large quantity of high-grade plastic explosives was stolen. Voss's fingerprints were found at the depot. However, security footage showed Voss was not the thief. He was actively tracking the terror cell behind the heist. The men who dumped Voss outside the hospital were not trying to save his life. They were trying to make him bleed out quietly as an unidentified John Doe. Wexler turned to Talia, his voice laced with deep suspicion. "You hid your military past. You performed an illegal procedure on a federal target. Who are you really?" Talia looked Wexler dead in the eye. "I am the person who kept your patient alive, so you could ask these questions." Talia walked into Voss's isolation room. Voss looked up at her from the bed. "When you recognized my face," Voss whispered, "did you regret saving me?" Talia replied coldly, "I haven't decided yet." Voss leaned back against the pillows. "I didn't betray your flight path, Sergeant. The leak came from inside your own command structure. I spent 5 years living like a ghost just to gather the hard evidence." Before Voss could say another word, his heart monitor shrieked. His airway was closing. Talia glanced at the intravenous line. Someone had tampered with his medication drip. At that exact moment, an unregistered private medical transport pulled up to the lower bay. 3 men dressed as paramedics stepped out. Talia watched them through the window. They were not checking patient charts. They were checking security camera angles and guard positions. They had not come to deliver a patient. They had come to ensure Elias Voss never walked out of Ardmore Regional alive. Talia knew that yelling would spark immediate gunfire in a crowded hallway. Instead, she reached for the manual fire alarm lever in the West Wing. Heavy steel containment doors slammed shut across the corridor, dividing the floor into isolated zones. Talia calmly guided civilian staff and ambulatory patients down the eastern stairwell, clearing the entire sector around Voss's room in under 60 seconds. Wexler watched her execute the evacuation with chilling precision. No panique. No screaming. She was using the hospital's own safety systems as a defensive shield. For the first time, Wexler understood that her actions in the trauma bay were not reckless gambles. They were the result of hard-learned combat discipline. "We need to move Voss to an operating room," Wexler insisted. The main or is a death trap, Talia countered. It has glass walls and single-door access. We go to the old physical therapy procedure room in the basement. It has independent oxygen, concrete walls, and a service tunnel exit. Wexler hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Lead the way. It was the first time in 6 years he had surrendered control of a tactical situation to anyone else. Meanwhile, Leona was evacuating an elderly cardiac patient who was terrified by the alarms. Instead of running, Leona remembered Talia's habit of acknowledging people directly. She knelt down, held the woman's hand, used her name, and promised she would not leave her side. Talia's influence had quietly reshaped the entire team. The armed infiltrators cut the hospital's main power grid, plunging the service corridors into dim red emergency lighting. Wexler's hands began to shake as he tried to keep Voss's breathing tube secure in the shadows. Talia took control of the room, her voice steady and clear. Dr. Wexler, focus on the airway. Leona, monitor the 4 lines. Tech, hold the battery backup. Guards, secure the inner door. Her clear commands cut straight through the panic. As they stabilized Voss, the old informant spoke through gasping breaths. The traitor was Colonel Richard Hale. He sold your flight route to fund his private network and framed me. Captain Ross knew before we crashed. He gave me an encrypted drive containing the proof. Voss pointed to a small, raised scar on his forearm. Underneath his skin was a micro drive containing the entire file. Voss reached out and touched Talia's arm. Ross told me to give it only to you. He wanted you to live your life without looking over your shoulder. Suddenly, the internal intercom crackled. The lead infiltrator's voice echoed through the speaker. Nurse Mercer. Hand over Voss and we leave the hospital without firing a single shot. Save your hospital or save the man who killed your crew. Voss looked at Talia. Do it. Hand me over. I've lived long enough. Talia turned to him, her eyes sharp as flint. 3 members of my crew died because someone decided human lives were leverage on a ledger. I will not repeat their math. Wexler looked at Talia in awe. You still hate him for what happened, don't you? Yes, Talia replied. But my job isn't to judge who deserves medical care. My job is to keep the human being in front of me breathing. Wexler felt a wave of profound shame. He had spent years hiding behind rigid protocols to protect himself from failure. Talia operated under a far stricter code. The life of the patient came before personal grief, personal fear, and personal hatred. Talia used the hospital's internal maintenance tunnels to guide Major Pike's tactical team straight behind the infiltrators. Using the magnetic door locks from the control panel, she trapped the armed squad inside a sealed airlock until federal officers stormed the bay. Voss gave Pike the decrypted coordinates of the stolen explosives. The device was located beneath a massive distribution center where 200 morning shift workers were currently walking through the gates. Federal agents intercepted the bomb with less than 12 minutes to spare. Not a single worker ever knew how close they had come to obliteration. As the smoke cleared, Wexler walked back into the basement room. He looked at Talia, who was checking Voss's blood pressure. Talia, Wexler said quietly, I need your help with the final suture. Talia picked up the needle driver. Let's finish the job, doctor. By mid-morning, the tactical units had cleared the building, and the hospital administrators gathered in the executive boardroom. Terrified of publicity and legal liability, the board pushed to hush up the entire incident. They insisted on upholding Talia's suspension for practicing medicine beyond her registered scope. Talia did not argue. She walked quietly into the break room and began packing her small locker into a cardboard box. Leona burst through the door, furious. Why aren't you fighting them, Talia? You saved this entire hospital. You stopped a domestic terror attack. Talia sealed the box with tape. I know how to keep people alive in the middle of a war zone, Leona. I never learned how to convince administrators that I belong in a civilian room. Before Talia could walk out the front doors, Dr. Wexler stepped into the main lobby. He held a thick file in his hands. He had completely rewritten the official incident report. In his revised statement, Wexler logged the absolute truth. The patient was in catastrophic vascular collapse. No vascular surgeon was physically capable of reaching the room in time, and Nurse Mercer's specialized intervention was the sole reason the patient survived. Furthermore, Wexler added a blistering personal critique of the hospital's rigid protocols, stating that the system's failure to adapt had nearly cost a man his life. He placed his own medical license on the line as collateral. Wexler then turned to face the entire gathered ER staff. For 6 years, I believed that absolute control was the only true form of professional responsibility, Wexler announced, his voice carrying across the quiet lobby. I was wrong. True responsibility means recognizing when someone else's courage and expertise exceed the boundaries of your own experience. He walked up to Talia and looked her in the eyes. I apologize, Talia. I questioned your integrity when I should have been learning from your resolve. You didn't break our rules out of arrogance. You broke them because our rules were insufficient to save a life. Later that afternoon, before Voss was transported to a secure military hospital, Talia entered his room one last time. Voss looked at her with hollow eyes. You should have let me die back on that table, Sergeant. It would have been easier for you. I didn't save you to give you an easy way out, Talia said firmly. I saved you so the truth would live long enough to destroy the men who actually pulled the trigger. Voss nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I'm sorry I couldn't save Ross, Miller, and Vance. Today, you brought their memory home, Talia whispered. That is enough. Sitting alone in the staff lounge later that night, Talia pulled out an audio recorder handed to her by Major Pike. She pressed play. Captain Daniel Ross's voice filled the quiet room through static. Mercer, if you're listening to this, it means you survived the crash. Listen to me carefully. Don't you dare turn surviving into a sin. You don't owe us a life spent in penance or pain. Keep bringing people home, Talia. But one day, give yourself permission to come home too. For the first time in 5 years, Talia bowed her head and wept quietly. She spoke the names of her 3 fallen comrades out loud into the empty room. The heavy weight resting on her shoulders finally slipped away. Leona walked in quietly, placed a fresh cup of hot coffee on the table, and sat beside her in silence. Talia did not pull away. The board dropped all disciplinary charges against Talia the next morning. They offered her a promotion to lead trauma coordinator. Talia accepted on one single condition: a mandatory policy update stating that whenever any medical worker believes a patient is dying, their voice must be heard before their title is checked. Dr. Graham Wexler was the very first person to sign his name to the new charter. 6 months later, the morning sun broke through the clean glass windows of Ardmore Regional. Talia Mercer sat at her familiar chair at the triage desk. Her back was still positioned against the wall, and her eyes still tracked every person coming through the emergency entrance. But she was no longer sitting alone. Leona sat beside her, laughing as they shared a warm pot of coffee. Talia had declined the offer to rejoin the military. Instead, she spent her off-duty hours teaching advanced emergency field stabilization to civilian nurses and EMTs, giving them the confidence to act when seconds meant the difference between life and death. Upstairs in the trauma bay, Dr. Wexler was preparing for a critical influx of patients from a highway multi-car collision. Before making his first incision, he turned to the young triage nurse standing in the corner. Does anyone see something in this room that I am missing? Wexler asked clearly. The young nurse pointed out an early subtle sign of internal pressure on the patient's monitor. Wexler nodded approvingly and adjusted his surgical plan instantly. Inside Talia's desk drawer, beneath her medical badges, sat a small framed photograph of her helicopter flight crew standing in the desert sun. Written on the back of the photo were the words, "Night Stalkers don't quit." Directly beneath it, in fresh blue ink, Talia had written one final line, "Not even on themselves." If this story reminded you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest battles, please like and subscribe for more dramatic stories. Tell us in the comments below, what takes more courage? Saving someone you love, or saving someone you haven't yet forgiven?